I got my PhD in a psychology program that had a pretty strong theoretical orientation, which meant that a lot of my classes introduced me to theories in psychology and doing theoretical work. Now, even though the program had this theoretical bent, I was pressured to write an empirical dissertation. And that pressure came in the form of, do you really want to write a theoretical dissertation? Now, I ended up writing a theoretical dissertation, and the whole time I thought, I'm shooting myself in the foot by doing this. But it ended up working out. I got a job. I have since written like 5 books that adopt this theoretical orientation and another dozen or 2 dozen articles. I have done empirical research as well, but it's really been split 50-50. So I want to talk about theoretical work in psychology and how it differs from empirical work, and really try to showcase psychological theory and philosophy as a worthwhile method. And in so doing, kind of compare it to empirical methods, which as of right now, still tend to have more power and social influence, although that's changing. So I want to talk a little bit about that too. So I guess to compare theoretical and philosophical psychology to empirical psychology, we can look at the theoreticians and philosophers of psychology doing mental, intellectual, and thinking work, and that this work is essential for moving psychology forward, for evaluating the discipline, for expanding things, shrinking things, making sure the work is headed in the right direction. Now, empirical work is done by gathering data and collecting observations and then analyzing that. So empirical work goes and collects data by making direct observations, whereas theoretical work is done privately. It can be done simply by reading books and thinking about issues. Now, if we rewind, actually, I'm going to borrow from this work by Andrei Kukla, Methods of Theoretical Psychology. This is an MIT Press book that was published about 20 years ago, but his work has been ongoing for at least 30 years, looking at his footnotes. 40 years, really. Kukla gave like a history of theoretical work in psychology, and of course, theory has been part of psychology the whole time, and we have, in Western thinking, kind of oscillated between being heavily influenced by theory, back to being heavily influenced by empiricism, and then back to being heavily influenced by theory. And the most recent pendulum swing was behaviorism in the middle of the 20th century. And behaviorists like Watson and Skinner took this, or adopted this extreme position of we can only learn about psychology through direct observation. If I can't observe it directly, it doesn't count. And that mindset really influenced American psychology. So much so that when I went to a PhD program with a theoretical orientation, I had multiple faculty kind of take me aside and say, you don't want to do a theoretical dissertation. No one will take you seriously. And what that does is kind of show the mindset of psychologists in the United States in particular, but over the last 50, 70, 100 years being heavily influenced and biased in the direction of empiricism. You must collect data in order for your study to qualify as a study. But of course, we don't get behaviorism without the first behaviorist doing theory, which is saying, like Skinner's position or Watson's position, the only thing that counts as data is something that I collect through observation, through empirical observation. That movement right there is a theoretical movement. Once that position has been taken, now data can be collected, but that first movement is theoretical. So I hope I haven't lost all of you. I hope I haven't confused you or bored you with that. I also want to talk a little bit more about some of the kinds of projects, the kinds of methods that theoretical and philosophical psychologists might use, give some examples to kind of illustrate that, some real world examples. So I'm going to draw on my own scholarship to some extent because, like I said, about half of my publications could be classified in this theoretical vein of psychology. So I tried to find my books in my library, but I couldn't track even one of them down. So I'm just going to tell you about them. I can't hold them up for you. One of my books was called Existential Health Psychology. And in that book, I talk about a new area of applied psychology that I think we need in hospitals. So we have health psychology, and my argument was that health psychologists are beneficial and they deserve to have jobs in hospitals. They're fulfilling an important role, but there's something that they miss. And the thing that they miss is very close to what the pastoral counselor, so like the reverend or whoever, the pastor that stays at the hospital, and so you go into the chapel of the hospital to talk to somebody. What is the chaplain or what is the pastor there treating? Well, they're treating the soul, maybe, but in the 21st century, this theistic religious perspective isn't taken for granted anymore. Plenty of people don't have a religion that they follow, so they don't really need a pastor to look after their soul. But there's still something about being a human and suffering, or going through the grief process and loss, or when you get a diagnosis and like you have to change your personality to include this new diagnosis moving forward. We need someone that can help with that transition process. And that's not a medical position. That's really not even a health psychology position, which is this medicalized field. I argue that we need people who can look after human existence, and I call that existential health psychology. Do I do a good job with that goal? I think so. And I've gotten some feedback about that. But ultimately, what I did in that book is I argued for expanding the role of health psychology, or I identified an area of psychology that I think isn't currently being covered, that we need to do better to fulfill that need in the healthcare system. Let's see, another book. Where did I write these down? Oh, my second book was called Expanding the Category Human. And that was based on my dissertation, my theoretical dissertation. And in it, I look at how psychology has typically defined its subject matter, human psychology. And I borrow some other current trends in philosophy in the 21st century on post-humanism and non-humanism, ultimately trying to leave behind the anthropocentric perspective, or the perspective that all that matters is human existence, human being. So like a example you're probably familiar with is, why should we take care of our earth that we live in, the planet that we're on? And the anthropocentric argument is so that our future generations have a place to live. The non-anthropocentric argument would be, well, it's just good to look after things, just for the sake of nature, for the sake of ecology, for the sake of all the other animal systems that deserve to be looked after as well, not just for us. It's not just a human problem. It's a much bigger problem than that. So I follow that line of reasoning, and I say that we can expand the subject matter of psychology by just expanding a little bit what it means to be human. And like another example of that would be, if you have a prosthetic leg, well, part of you is not organically human. You have a prosthetic, something that resembles or mimics human movement, but isn't. It's this composite material. You're not a bionic person, but there's aspects of who you are now that don't fit into the traditional category of human. So we need to expand that category. And of course, with AI, with machine learning, there's a lot of areas of human understanding that have expanded in non-human ways. So I'm getting bored talking about these, so I'm guessing you're getting bored listening to them. So just a couple of examples of work that you might do in theoretical psychology. Let me go through now. I guess I'll say I've been a member of Division 24 of the American Psychological Association, Division for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, probably more than any other division I've been a member of. But I can't really tell you what the mission statement is. And even though I do a lot of this work, I'm not really guided by specific guidelines. So when I came up with these 5 objectives of theoretical psychology, I'm kind of going off the cuff for myself. I did some theoretical work. I sat down, I thought, okay, what is the role that needs to be filled by theoretical psychologists? And this is what I came up with. And I've got some exemplars I may go into, some great examples that demonstrate each of these goals. So one is defining the subject matter. What is it that psychologists should concern themselves with? If we go back to the 19th century, 1890 is about when this was happening, there wasn't a subdiscipline, or there wasn't a standalone discipline of psychology. That evolved. It came out of philosophy, it came out of physiology and biology departments. And some theoretical work had to be done to say this is its own discipline, it deserves its own methods, it deserves its own questions and studies and so on. Sorry, I feel like someone might be coming inside. We've got someone doing work on the house, and my dogs are freaking out. So someone had to initially say this is a standalone subject matter. Now, that happened one time, but it has continued to evolve since then. Some psychologists came along and said, we need to stop asking those questions. Those are irrelevant. We need to start asking these questions. These are important. And then a few decades go by and everything changes again. So all of those changes, all of the determination of what qualifies as psychology and what needs to qualify as psychology but doesn't right now, that work is done by theoretical psychologists. So just to take a minute and reflect on maybe a study that you are interested in, or a topic that you're interested in, don't limit yourself. Like, say you're interested in artificial intelligence and therapy, so using AI bots as therapists. Like, maybe that's your topic, and I'm just going to go with that with this little mini lecture. Is therapy with an AI program real therapy, or is something sort of missing from that? So as a theoretical psychologist, you might say, okay, well, what are the absolute requirements for therapy? Like, what is, like, without these components, we can't call something therapy. Does there have to be another human involved? Possibly not. It depends on what therapy is. So what is the objective of therapy? So what are the absolutely necessary objectives for therapy in order for some interaction to be called therapy? Is it just a conversation? Well, no, there has to be an objective at hand. Does there have to be one person doing the work and one person receiving the work? Right. So you would go through each of these steps and try to figure out, okay, what's the absolute minimum requirement for a relationship to be a helping one? Once you've established that, does an AI bot program satisfy that part of the relationship? Now, what you'd be doing is simply thinking about this problem, thinking through the possible conditions, and making a determination. You wouldn't create an AI therapy bot and then use it and see what happens. That would be empirical. This is work you're doing on the front end, thinking about what are the necessary conditions for something to be considered therapy. All right, so that's defining the subject matter. And a lot of the work I've done has wound up being about that. Another task for a theoretical psychologist is determining research methods. What qualifies as data? What's considered good research and bad research? What sorts of questions can you ask? What sorts of questions are you incapable of asking? And again, if we go through the history of psychological methods, we'll see different methods kind of come up as popular, and then after a time they kind of fade and new ones take their place. Each time that transition happens, someone is leading the way saying, this is inadequate, or it needs to be changed in a certain way, or this is the way it ought to be done. And so there are methodologists would be that title, but methodologists are doing theoretical work, talking about how methods need to be developed. I can't imagine any of you, if you're just getting started in the field, would be interested in designing methods, but I'll tell you, I have like 5 or 6 different articles where I design new methods because I feel like the existing ones were inadequate to answer my research question or really understand data. So I almost always wind up making changes and then writing a whole article defending why these changes were made. So I do find that fun. But you might even ask yourself, when you're practicing research or collecting data or trying to answer a question, and you just feel like the method is clunky, you might ask yourself, how do I think I should be doing this? What steps should I be taking? What makes the most sense to me and why? So that would be perhaps a way to think about research methods for your topic. Another objective is that theoretical and philosophical psychologists guide practice. So I talked about methodology and research. Practice would be when psychologists go to work. Maybe it's a therapist, maybe it is a life coach, maybe it is a psychoanalyst or a school psychologist or an industrial organizational psychologist. All of these people are applying sort of knowledge that has been collected through research into real-world settings. So it's the applied version of psychology. What are the ethics for doing psychology? Do there need to be ethical considerations? What are the best, safest practices? I think a lot of this can be determined empirically. So right now I'm sort of scrambling to think of how this is theoretical. Okay. Like I said earlier, the definition of therapy, what is absolutely necessary in order for something to be considered therapy, and what happens if a practitioner isn't offering that or providing that for their clients. So one thing I've thought a lot about is whether or not therapists need to be liked by their clients. A lot of therapy has to do with growing up, developing, taking responsibility. And these are things that we adults, we humans, often don't want to do. We want other people to take responsibility for us. And it is very difficult for us to admit that, okay, I need to take responsibility for this, because we don't want to admit our problems. We don't want to admit our shortcomings or mistakes. So the therapist, in my opinion, when I think about this, the therapist is probably doing a good job if they're disliked, not just being an asshole per se, but also not being polite. Because if the therapist can't give it to the client straight, who can? And so, is it necessary, this was a question earlier, is it necessary that a client likes their therapist? In the customer satisfaction economic perspective, yeah, if you want to get money, if you want to get paid, if you want clientele to seek you out and pay you, you're going to have to do something that makes them wanting to come back for more. And so the economic side kind of runs counter to the effectiveness side. The economic side of therapy undermines the therapeutic efficacy, at least when I think about it. And now that I say it, I'm reminded of a long-time practicing therapist, Miles Groth, who I've worked with. But his argument was you cannot accept money for therapy without undermining the entire therapeutic relationship. And so that kind of position is a theoretical one. It was arrived at, or it was derived from thinking processes, and it will then guide practice. Okay, the last one I'm going to share. I have ethics down here too, but I really don't know what to say about that. I've never done any sort of ethical work. Not that I abide in unethical work. I've never thought about enforcing ethics or writing ethics or deriving ethics. So ethics is a topic, but I'm not going to cover it. The last one I have here is that theoretical and philosophical psychologists evaluate the achievement of psychology. And so for this, you would have to think about or ask yourself, is psychology doing a good job? Is psychology doing a good job at treating mental health disorders? Is psychology doing a good job at diagnosing mental health disorders? A controversy here, perhaps. We know that mental health disorders are on the rise, but that's also because we've changed how we define them. So famously in 2013, I believe, the DSM-5 came out and replaced the DSM-4. And depression, for example, had a lower bar for diagnosis, which means that people that formerly did not satisfy the diagnosis suddenly do satisfy the diagnosis. Nothing changed about them, just the diagnostic criteria changed. And so now we had this artificial bump in depression diagnoses and then subsequent treatment. Is that good or bad? Is having more people treated for depression a good thing or a bad thing? Is it helpful or does it create dependency? Those kinds of questions, and I'm just talking about mental health treatment, diagnosis and treatment, but psychologists have a reach that's much further than that, into schools, into workplaces, into homes and relationships and parenting and child rearing, development, personality, memory, all of these things. Is psychology doing a good job? Not an adequate job, not an okay job. Are they doing a good job, or is there room for improvement? If so, what do you see as room for improvement, and how do we affect that improvement? So those are 4 different areas of theoretical and philosophical psychology. I gave an example of defining the subject matter. And I'm trying to think. Oh, it's the AI therapy bot example. So evaluating achievements. So you might think that. So perhaps from where you're coming from, and you think of AI chatbots as therapists, you might see this huge untapped potential where everyone can have their own private therapist, and you might see that as a good thing, and that as psychologists, we ought to promote that. We need to figure out how to maybe educate the lay consumer of technology products how to use ChatGPT or whatever AI program they have access to, Copilot, it's here in front of me, use these AI programs to serve as their therapist. So maybe there's certain types of questions that you need to ask in order to get it started, or how to start that dialogue to be effective. As you can tell, it's not a very inspiring question for me, but I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to think with you about how you might explore theoretical and philosophical psychology with your topic. So you might come up with guidelines for practice using AI therapists. You might evaluate the limitations of face-to-face therapists as being too expensive, for example. And so like maybe the whole critique, you might do a critique of applied psychology and say, yes, therapists are wonderful, but no one can afford them, or the people who can afford them need them the least. And so you might talk about how therapists are out of reach of the people who need them most. And so we need a free therapy, and AI chatbots might be the solution to that. I'm not arguing for this, by the way, just trying to give you some ideas. And then I think for research methods, I suggested that you think about what's the most what's the most interesting way to understand this topic? So how might we study the effectiveness of AI chatbots, the quality of AI chatbots for as therapists? What sort of data would you want to look at? Um, what should the benchmark for achievement be? I mean, you can decide these things. What you're doing is making a proposal. There is no consensus. There's no protocol for evaluating the quality of an AI therapist because they don't exist yet. We're only starting to look at that. People are only starting to use them in that way. You can be the person to come up with a way of evaluating the effectiveness, or maybe a protocol for using one, or training one to be your therapist. I hope that if I've accomplished nothing else in this little talk, I've communicated the kinds of questions that theoretical and philosophical psychologists can ask, the way they orient themselves to the discipline, and really how any topic can be approached from this perspective. I have a whole bunch of exemplars, uh, articles and book chapters that I really liked. Maybe I'll go through some of them individually, but I think as it stands right now, that should be pretty comprehensive.